Whoa.
So what do you girls do for fun?
Fun?
Hey everyone, welcome to Book Club. I'm your host, Thomas, or as I'm known in book club, Sir Thomas St. Thomas. Thanks for that, Beverly. I'm going to be taking us through an intro for our book this month. It's the Gulag Archipelago. I'm sure many people have heard of it. This is a copy that we're utilizing. It's not the 50th anniversary, which came out recently, which our buddy Jordan Peterson got to write the intro to. It's a little bit older. And it is the abridged version. I've only read the abridged version. If you don't know, the original was in 3 different volumes. And maybe one day or somebody else will go through all 3 volumes, but that can be quite a chore. And I think the abridged version is, it gets us through exactly what we need to know about this book. And in this new format of book club, and we used to come on and just have everyone discuss the book that we're reading for the month. In this new format, what we decided to do was advocate for a book. So if you advocated for a book, it meant that you had to go through the process of letting us know why you're advocating for the book. And then we'd bring in everybody and discuss that book. So when I thought of the concept of advocating for a book, it made me think that what I need to do is convince people that it's a book they should read. And we often talk about books, and we might, if you have a bunch of friends who like to read books, you might recommend what you would call a good book. And I wanted to advocate for something that wasn't simply just a good book. And the Gulag is a good book. It's fun to read in some sense, in a real dark humor sense. But it's also an important book. So when I thought of advocating for it, it was because I think of it as an important book. And this wasn't the first time I had read it. I actually did a reread for the purposes of this club, and because I'd be advocating, I wanted to make sure that I had something current, hopefully somewhat coherent, together to make sure that I could convince people that it was a book that was worth their time, because it's not only good, but it's important. And the reason I think it's important, or what any important book would mean that it's telling the reader something they need to know. It goes beyond into being entertaining. So we might have a book that we take on vacation. We want to read at the beach when we have a lot of free time and we don't need to focus too much. We want something a little bit lighter. And this is definitely not a light book. So when I say an important book and something that people should read, I think this one is important because it communicates what would be a universal truth about the nature of humanity. And it looks into some really dark places throughout our history. And unfortunately, probably what I think is one of the best ways to understand the nature of humanity is by looking in those dark places, because it not only tells us what we're capable of doing and what we need to avoid, but whenever you look into those dark places, you often see a bit of light. And throughout history, there's always going to be dark places, whether it's country to country or individual to individual. And it's not whether or not I as an individual or us as a country or a neighborhood, etc., is going to be in a dark place. It's when. And this book talks about one of those dark places, but it also talks about people within those dark places and the light that they shone, even though they were under those circumstances. And then it goes even further than that and talks about, well, why is it that some people were able to survive and sometimes thrive in those situations? And what was it about those people that was different than anybody else? And in some sense, it's also a book about history. But I think that this type of historical book and the way it's written is much better than what we are used to in our elementary, high school, even some of our university classes. Excuse me. It's got dates and times and places and names of individuals, but it doesn't just list them as a whole bunch of things that we need to memorize so we can get them right on a multiple choice test. What it does is it takes us through the patterns that exist in the nature of humanity and helps us to understand why those things happen, and then even see some of those same things in those patterns today, so we can use those lessons in humanity and start recognizing them today, know where to look, what to look for, and what, if anything, can be done about it. So to get started on the actual book itself, I think that the context with which it was published is really important to understand, and why it's so important. So one of the things that I was thinking when I first read the book, and it talks about, and we all know about the history of, in some respect, the history of repression in the Soviet Union at the time throughout the 20th century. I mean, 18 million people ended up in prison in the gulags. The word gulag was actually created specifically for the Soviet Union. So, everyone understands how much oppression was going on there, but oppression is an abstract concept. It's very different than when you actually look at what was going on to those individual people. And I kept thinking, well, if it's so oppressive, how does something like this get published? And the interesting thing was, this book was at the time never published in the Soviet Union. So how do we even know about it? Well, the author, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, after being released from the Gulag and being in exile for some time, finally returned to the Soviet Union and living as what would be called at the time a free citizen, a comrade, as they would say. And he had something to say. So what he did is he utilized his time to write a book. And that book that he wrote, it was called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Sorry, my Russian is more than faulty. And even that book, what it does is it goes through a day in the life of a person in the gulags. And if you've read the Gulag Archipelago, you know about some of the torture that they went through in some of the, probably all of the camps, especially during the interrogation phase, when they were trying to get people to admit to some kind of crime. And in this book that Solzhenitsyn wrote, A Day in the Life, he doesn't even go into the torture itself. It really is just an incredibly detailed account of what happens to the soul of a person when they're in this camp. And at the time it was published, we're beyond Stalin, we're beyond Lenin, they're both dead. And Khrushchev is now in power. But it's still the Soviet Union, so why is it that we're even hearing about any of this? Well, it's important to remember the context here, because Khrushchev was a part of this system of the Gulag. There's a famous story, well, not too famous, but famous enough to be and useful here, that there's a point in time where when Stalin was still alive and he was still head of the Soviet Union, that Khrushchev was standing at one of the tables at one of the meetings, and Stalin slipped a piece of cake on his seat. So Khrushchev ends up sitting on the cake, and Stalin used to use tactics like that to humiliate people, even within his own command. So Khrushchev was known to hate Stalin. So now you're in a situation where Khrushchev has this hated, dead mentor, previous mentor, and he's now in charge of the Soviet Union. But during his time when he was in charge of the Soviet Union, he was also actually part of the system that was putting people in the gulags, murdering people by the millions. So what do you do about that? Well, what you do is you start pointing fingers. So one of the ways he pointed fingers is by allowing this one individual to publish this one book. And he probably had no idea what would happen once he published that one book. So now you have this book being circulated throughout the Soviet Union, where about 1 million people live that had been in these camps. And they are reading this book. It's on fire. Everybody's talking about it. And now Khrushchev is in a difficult position because, for a second, he wants to point the finger at Stalin and say, look at all these things that Stalin did. But at the same time, he has crimes to answer for as well. So through a mistake or just maybe Khrushchev's inability to see into the future and understand the reaction that would happen, he released this book. So that already put Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn on the world stage. He then published his second book, which he had to do actually in the West. He wasn't able to do in Russia. And it was called Cancer Ward. There was a period of time when he suffered from cancer, and his second book, Cancer Ward, was about healthcare in the Soviet Union in some sense, and really the fatalistic manner in which it was delivered there. So then what happens is he starts putting together a manuscript for the Gulag Archipelago. And one of the reasons he did that was because after he started writing about the Gulag in A Day in the Life, he started receiving thousands and thousands of letters from people who experienced much of the same things that he did. And in that repressive environment, you don't have anybody publishing these things in the paper, in the magazines. People just don't talk about it. There's this sense in the Soviet Union that the past is the past. Why are you bringing up this hurt and painful thing? Let's move on to the future. We've got a lot of things to work on. But, there are things that happen to sores like that when they are allowed to fester. And Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn knew that. And it was also unfair to all the people that he was imprisoned with. And he wanted to get those stories out. So what he's doing is taking all of those stories and starting to get documents as much as he can get about the history of the Gulag and what was going on there, and combining them into a story that helped outline the manner in which people were arrested, the repression that happened, the interrogation, who was doing it, and really the scale of this whole operation, and how it was not just something that happened aside of the Soviet Union, kind of like where, every society has prisons, but that it was an essential byproduct of the actual ideology itself. And it was inescapable once they decided to go down this path. So I wanted to read a quote from the book here as we started to go into this process here. Excuse me while I find it. So when he was talking about the ideology of the Soviet Union at the time, it had a lot to do with man as being the center point for what is to be known, and there is nothing above man. So I thought this quote was important and made a lot of sense, and gives us the idea of what the author saw as the central problem in the Soviet Union and why they went down this path. Power is a poison, well known for thousands of years. If only no one were ever to acquire material power over others, but to the human being who has faith in some force that holds dominion over all of us, and who is therefore conscious of his own limitations, power is not necessarily fatal. For those, however, who are unaware of any higher sphere, it is a deadly poison. For them, there is no antidote. So, in the author's mind, one of the issues that they ran into with their system is that they elevated mankind to the highest rung of power at the top of the hierarchy. And without some kind of guiding principle, they fell into this trap of looking only to power. And if man is at the top of the hierarchy, the only way they can have power, which is always something that is relative, power itself is always relative. You can only have power over other people, which is why they went down this path in the author's mind. Now, as far as the content itself, I think one of my favorite chapters is, luckily enough, one of the first. It's about the arrests. And one of the things that I really loved about this first chapter is that it really gets into the process of what people go through when they're being arrested, why they're being arrested, how they're being arrested, how that process evolves, and why it is that people don't stand up. So for Solzhenitsyn, it really all starts with his arrests. And it's important to know that he was a well-educated man. I think he studied mathematics at university. He was an artillery officer and he had served his country with distinction. He had tons of medals and was actually responsible for a lot of wins in their battle in World War II. And he was actually in the field at the time he's summoned. So imagine being a soldier, you're an officer, you're in the field, and you get summoned to your brigadier commander's office. And you report and close the door, and there's several other officers there with you. And then two counterintelligence officers who are hiding behind the regular officers pop up. And in a really theatrical sense, they announce, "You are under arrest." And it was interesting because as he's building up to this point, he talks about all the people who have been arrested before. And the answer or the response to that, "You are under arrest," for everybody is always, "Me, what for?" And he said he found himself in that exact situation where he said, "Me, what for?" And that was one of the key ingredients with the Soviet process of getting people arrested in the Gulag, is that nobody was ever allowed to know what it was they were arrested for. And in the author's case, it was a little bit different. He found that his brigadier commander, who had never really spoken to him before, not in a mean way, but an incredibly professional way where he gave him his orders and that was it. He said, "Solzhenitsyn, come on over here." And he asked him one question. He says, "You have a friend who is now fighting on the Ukrainian front. Is that correct?" And the counterintelligence officers shouted out, "How dare you? You have no right." And I found that really interesting because, and unique in this, the author put that forth as well as being incredibly unique because he then knew exactly why he was being arrested, unlike thousands and thousands of other people. He had a friend on the Ukrainian front who he had been writing letters to. And in one of those letters, the author criticized Stalin. And they were reading those letters. And as soon as they saw this letter that he was criticizing Stalin in, they arrested him. And they arrested him because the person he was writing to ratted him out. And then you would even think, well, why would this person rat out his friend? Well, when you know that everybody is reading everything and you receive a letter where your president is being criticized, what happens if you don't rat him out? Well, when they arrest your friend, they're going to come arrest you. And then your crime is not ratting somebody out that you know is a political dissident. So that's the type of fear and the type of tension that amounts in a society where you know you're under surveillance, where you know the wrong words, the wrong criticism itself, etc., can land you in jail. Not only does it make you scared to say things, it makes you scared not to say things, because now you are in a position where you need to point out who is doing what, because if you don't, you're going to have your own consequences. And one of the things that he talks about is why people just don't stand up. If people are being arrested for what they think is nothing, why don't they just say, hey, stop, protest, do whatever it takes? And he says this: universal innocence also gives rise to the universal failure to act. Maybe they won't take you. Maybe it will all blow over. And that's the thing about constantly arresting innocent people, is you think that they were innocent and you're not sure that they did anything wrong, and they proclaim their innocence. So you assume that because you're innocent, that it's not going to happen to you too. But what you don't realize, it doesn't matter who is or who isn't innocent. It's about filling up the system and providing the bodies. Now, there are several things in this book that I really enjoyed, and I hope a lot of you who have read it, or some of the people in the book club, have enjoyed those things as well. And there was a couple of different lines, and I'm going to read another quote that helps put this in context of the manner in which this type of insanity can lead to just pure stupidity in a whole population. This one's a little bit longer, so please bear with me, but I think it's worth it. And the author says, here is one vignette from those years as it actually occurred. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province. It was presided over by a new secretary of the district party committee, replacing one recently arrested. At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leaped to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. The small hall echoed with stormy applause, rising to an ovation for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. The stormy applause rising to an ovation continued, but palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly, even to those who really adored Stalin. However, who would dare be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party committee could have done it. He was standing on the platform, and it was he who had just called for the ovation, but he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who had been arrested. He was afraid. After all, NKVD men, which was the precursor for the KGB, were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who quit first. And in that obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could, of course, cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly. But up there with the presidium, where everyone could see them, the director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the presidium, aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation. He still kept on applauding. 9 minutes, 10. In anguish, he watched the secretary of district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity to the last man, with make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going to go on and on applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. And even then, those who were left after would not falter. Then after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a business-like expression and sat down in his seat. And, oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stepped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That first man who stopped clapping, he was arrested and he ended up in the gulag. So that's the type of insanity that goes on. And it reminded me of something that we're seeing today, where it's not necessarily what you say, but sometimes it's what you don't say. So when you're posting on social media, when you're declaring things, it's not just, you can't necessarily just sit on the sidelines anymore, because people start to become suspicious of what you're not saying, what you're not doing. Are you not sharing a black square when everybody is? And it doesn't get that extreme yet, of course. And very often people say, yeah, but well, this isn't Stalinism. This isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't Cuba. This isn't China. And it's true. But, history isn't exact. It's the ideas that underlie that type of activity. And somebody once said that, and I really like this idea, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And when we see these ideas popping up and these people taking these actions, there's some underlying structure that is the same. And we're starting to see some of that same stuff here today. And one of the things I wanted to share was, it's one thing to think of the Gulag as a single place where there's a lot of men and women who are locked up, made to work, lay bricks in the cold tundra in Siberia. But it's another thing to really understand the massive expansion of that. So I have a map, and Beverly, would you mind sharing the map on screen for me here? So in the book, there is a time where he talks about the extensiveness of this system. And it's important to remember that this is the Soviet Union at the time, and this includes a lot of places that are no longer part of Russia. Now, this landmass is bigger than the whole of the European landmass. Every single one of those little dots is a gulag, a prison camp. In every single one of those little dots at any one time is between 2,000 and 10,000 people. So when we talk about the gulags, it's not just a few camps here and there. It's a massive system that spread across a landmass greater than Europe that at some time housed 18 million people. Now, not necessarily at one time, but about 18 million people went through that system. And many of them died. Toward the end of the existence of these gulags, assuming none of them exist today, and I bet there's, in some respects, some of them still do, but only about 1 million people came home. So I think it's important to remember the massive amount of people who were locked up here. Thanks, Beverly. You can take it off screen. So before we get into the discussion, and I wrap up why I wanted to be an advocate for this book, I start out with talking about why books are important as compared to just good, and why I was an advocate for this book. And it's a great way to look at history, the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the 19th century, and what was going on, not only during World War II, but shortly thereafter. And that it's not just to look at dates and times and places and being aware that 18 million people were locked up in these gulags and tortured in unspeakable ways. But for it to be important, for me to be an advocate of this book, it would have to share a lesson about the nature of humanity. And I think that nature that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn found in the gulags is best said by this one quote. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds. and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various stages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood, but his name doesn't change. And to that name, we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. So it's that concept that I keep referring back to in my mind whenever I think of this novel, and how it affects, how it teaches us about the nature of humanity. And in essence, it's a reminder that the path to tyranny doesn't lie outside of us. It's not some other country. It's not some other ethnicity. It's not some other political party. It's not a bunch of unvaccinated people. It's not white people. It's you and it's me. And it lives in the heart of every single human being. And unless we're looking inward and making sure that whatever that line that vacillates from one side to the other of good and evil is moving towards good as often as possible, that regardless of how far it gets to the good, there's always going to be a slice of evil there. And you have to be aware of it. And if you're too busy looking out at other people and doing what's too easy by saying, oh, there's the bad guy, that line of evil is going to start to eat away that good. And you're going to find that you turn into the monster that you claim to be fighting. So thanks for that time. I'm hoping we can have a great discussion about this book. So Beverly, that's it for me up front. I appreciate it.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, Carter.
Dude, all the spots that I had highlighted was like, oh, these were the ones that I find you and I are often on the same page. And
yeah, we have similar highlights very often.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up something that one of the first things you highlighted was this section. For me, it's on page 68 in the abridged version. But this excluded by the nature of their work and by deliberate choice from the higher sphere of human existence, the servitors of the Blue Institution lived in their lower sphere with all the. This is the part you're talking about where,
power.
If you just leave power up to if you just leave power up to people without a who are not guided by what he's calling the higher sphere of human existence, and the reason that I both like and dislike this is I think he's 100% correct in that you need something that is not your base, just whimsical, craven kind of desires for power or whatever. Like that's definitely a problem. But when I read this, I think this is universal principles. This is what the Enlightenment, parts of the Enlightenment, at least the thinkers that were responsible for America, as opposed to the thinkers that were responsible for the Soviet Union, because obviously they're both Enlightenment era thinkers, right? And we tend to think of the Enlightenment as people like John Locke, but you could just as easily say, well, Karl Marx is part of the Enlightenment, right? Rousseau, right? And say, okay, well, so that branch of the Enlightenment did not adopt these same universal principles that the Western branch did. And obviously saying one is Western is weird because they're co-located, but just ideologically, And so I view that as like, yes, universal principles are very important, and in fact they're crucial. But the thing that I don't like about this, and I know that Solzhenitsyn is religious and he comes at this from a very religious perspective, and what I don't like about that is, um, it's obvious to me that religion doesn't prevent this behavior either. That religion on its own is also used to justify horrific treatment of people, and so there's something beyond just a mere belief in a higher sphere. It matters what those ideas are, and uh, if those ideas are in the on the realm of universal um individual rights, and that people have some uh you know I'll use the word equality, even though I don't technically mean equality, but like universal equality, at least
Equal
legally and
dignity.
morally, yeah, then then you get one set of beliefs. But if those principles are, the end justifies the means because this is for a greater good, whether that greater good is because God told me or because it's the state, you still end up with horrific results. And I think you have people who use religion to justify good principles, and to say, well, these are like, God is good and these are the principles that matter, and he wants people to be treated equally with dignity, and that's why I'm going to do this good thing. But you also have people who use religion the complete opposite way, and it's like, well, God's appointed me king, or has appointed so and so person king, and this is all for some greater good, it's some greater plan, and therefore treating people horribly is fine. And so um that was the part that really, and that's early in the book, right? That's like, I think that's in the second or
Yeah.
third chapter, the blue caps chapter. um
Yeah. Blue caps
but
is
that's something
probably
that
the
really resonated. I really liked that he brought that up, because I thought it was a good thing to be thinking about. And I don't know, I'm wondering what other people think about that.
Here's to me a big thing about human nature is that Enlightenment philosophy and religion are both tools in the human toolbox. Whether or not they're used for good or evil is up to whether or not the person wants to do good or evil. And I mean that in the looking at their actions, not necessarily like, do they literally want to twirl their mustache, be evil, but like the outcome that they want emotionally, psychologically, they're going to find a way to justify it, either through religion or philosophy, such as Marx. So to me, it is really it's a tool. It is not inherently good. It is not inherently evil. I think secularists have a really big problem with looking at religion and going, oh, it's evil because people have used it for evil. And it's like, no, there's also been people who've used it for good. So to me, that's a big thing behind any kind of philosophy, any kind of moral philosophy. Like, you can tell people until you're blue in the face that your morals and your principles matter, and that these are like, this is the best way to structure your ideology so that you're not hurting people. But if they will find a way to twist it, if necessary, to get to the pain they want to cause. That's the real problem. It's human nature. I just don't believe that any idea is what is the word I'm looking for? Like, can't be used this way. Like, I don't see any idea being protected from human nature. And some people's desire to use it to hurt others.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truth to both of those points. But one thing I want to remind people, if they haven't read the book or don't realize, is the author became religious, but he wasn't religious when he entered the gulags. And one of the reasons that he started looking into religion was a lot of the people who were in the gulags who seemed to not be crushed by it were religious people. Not always, but very often. That's what he found. And as far as religion being used one way or the other, just based on the person, I think it's also, we have to make sure that we remember that religions in some sense are just ideas. And there is good and bad inherent in the ideas themselves. So I wouldn't say any idea can be used anyway. And I think I always think of this example. When I think of the United States or the West in general, and then I think of the Middle East, and then I think of Israel. Those are all very different places and very different locations for the most part. But the Middle East is very different from the United States when it comes to the people and the philosophies and the ideas. Now, Israel is in the same area, but they're very different than the people that surround them. But they're also very similar to the United States, even though they're in very different locations. And I think that that speaks in part to the nature of the ideas at the base of a lot of those societies as well. Because the reason the United States and Israel, in some sense, is very similar, where people call it Little America, isn't just by chance. I think there are some very similar ideas that in the cultures that exist, which is why they're so similar, even though they're in such different places. So I wouldn't want to say, religion is religion, and regardless of which one you choose, it depends on whether or not you want to use it for ill or not. But I think that we have to give those different religions their due, in the sense that they do have different ideas at the base of their philosophies.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I don't want to speak for Alex. Maybe she can speak up here, but I think one thing I was getting from what Alex was saying was that, not to simplify it, but humans are really good at rationalizing. So if you get someone who wants to do evil, they could literally twist anything to do the evil that they want to do. They can reinterpret language. They can say, oh, well, this was metaphorical, or they didn't mean this, or this word actually means that. Like, people can rationalize whatever. If you really want to do evil, this is similar to the argument of, like, the founders of America wrote a constitution and thought this will prevent people from doing these bad things. And, like, here we are a couple hundred years later, and people are just willing to, like, well, that's not what they meant by this word that clearly means this other thing. I've decided it means this, so that we can, I would like to be able to tax someone for growing potatoes in their own backyard and eating them. Like, that's in the Constitution, right? Like, people are willing to just do whatever they want because they're willing to rationalize if they really have a driving factor. But I also agree with Thomas's point that the underlying ideas matter a great deal. So we are, as bad as we are right now, we're a far cry from Saudi Arabia.
Right. Well, there was something else, as far as ideas go, I thought was really interesting. So on page 43, he talks about the arrests and the interrogations. And one of the things that I found is that what they started to say is that when we sign a sentence ordering someone to be shot, we can never be absolutely certain, but only approximately, in view of certain hypotheses and in a certain sense, that we are punishing a guilty person. Thence arose the most practical conclusion, that it was useless to seek absolute evidence, for evidence is always relative or unchallengeable witnesses, for they can say different things at different times. The proofs of guilt were relative, approximate to, and the interrogator could find them even when there was no evidence and no witness without leaving his office, basing his conclusions not only on his own intellect, but also on his party's sensitivity, his moral forces. In other words, the superiority of someone who has slept well, has been well fed, and has not been beaten up, and on his character. So what they started to do is, in the interrogations, they never looked for witnesses. They never looked for evidence. What they started to rely on was the accused admitting to the transgression or to the crime. And I'm starting to, there's so many things, especially as I reread this book this time, that I'm starting to see parallels on, where when you are attacked on social media, if it's a Twitter mob, you say the wrong thing, et cetera, et cetera. There's nobody looks and says, okay, well, let's look at what was said. Let's look at the context. Let's figure out whether or not this was right or wrong. What they do is they try to punish you until you apologize for doing something wrong. Aha, see, that's our evidence of the wrongdoing. It's not that there was any proof of anything. There's no philosophical discussion, nothing deep at all. It's only the confession of that person accused. And I kept seeing all these parallels. And even with the arrests, where you're not allowed to know what your crime was or who did what, Title IX. When you have these people in colleges that are going up on these college courts and being accused of very often sexual crimes, they're getting kicked out of college. They can't go to any other college. But what they do is, and in part, I understand why, because they want victims to come forward. But that person who's accused never gets to know who accused them, what they were accused of, no investigation necessary. You're done. So all of these ideas we keep seeing pop up today in the very same sense. They're not as extreme, and we'll get yelled at for saying, yeah, but you know what, big deal. You know what, they can go to some other school or whatever, which often isn't the case. But like I said, it's a rhyme of history. We don't have to get to the exacts, but you have to have those bad ideas, and those bad ideas are starting to fester again.
Well, and then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
I was just going to say that, and because I study the Title IX issue a lot, it's very important to me. We have this idea, though, that it's like, well, since it's not that bad, we shouldn't have to do anything about it. And it's like, first of all, that's that one person's only, life on this planet. And who knows how much money they already put into going to this university. So yes, we do have to do something about it. And secondly, there's going to be someone tomorrow, and then the next day, and the next day, and it's going to grow. And pretending as if one instance isn't bad enough to start moving forward with making changes is stupid. That is a rationalization to not do anything.
So Gita, you were going to say?
You were going to say something.
I was going to say the default was the guilt, not the innocence. It was, you were presumed to be guilty, and we cannot let go a person who may be guilty of something versus trying to, protect the innocence of a person. We're just presuming that everybody's guilty. And because it's impossible to prove, everything is relative, well, we can't prove that this person is innocent. So we're just going to assume everyone is guilty. And just an easy way to write millions of people off. And yeah.
You just described what anti-racism is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing this as just different forms, different, maybe slightly different semantics, but it's it's the same.
Yeah. Certainly different levels of
severity, of a different kind.
But yeah. You're reminding me of something that Thomas touched on this, and sorry, I had to go get some tea because I'm not 100% feeling better. So I missed part of what you were talking about, Thomas, but I think you touched on this where they don't care so much about, you can see, one of the things I got out of this was there's not really an individualist outlook, in that you aren't really an individual. You're a number or a check on there's a quota, and they don't really care. Like if I go to Thomas's house to arrest Thomas, but he's not home, I'll arrest someone else. Like it doesn't matter. And he cited cases of people who, one of the things he was talking about was how few people resisted, because everyone had this feeling of like, well, I didn't do anything wrong, so I'm sure if they arrest me, they'll be able to figure it out, and like, we'll right the wrong because I'm innocent. So like they kind of still have some kind of trust in the system that even if I get arrested, I'm going to comply. Like, why would I fight? Like that, I could die fighting. Like, why would I fight? We'll sort this out. I'm going to comply and be a good citizen, good comrade, and it'll get sorted out later because I know I'm innocent. And those people perished, or at the very least ended up, with 10 years or a quarter or whatever. Like they ended up suffering. But some of the people that did resist or fled, they just never bothered to go after because it was difficult, and they were literally just trying to get quotas filled. So it was like, well, Thomas ran away to some other place, and like he's kind of hard to get now, and who cares? Like cross him off. It doesn't matter. He wasn't on my list per se as Thomas, as having done something. It was like, his neighbor's here, he'll do, and they forget about Thomas, and like he goes on and lives his life. I think that was fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think two things here is there was one woman who resisted. They tried to arrest her in a public place in the middle of the day. And what she did is she just went home. And then she got arrested at night. So it was like, you didn't even figure out that because they couldn't get you that day and you made a scene, that they were going to come back at night. And what they started doing is only arresting people at night in their homes. And as far as the collectivization of it, it reminds me, and I love this passage because if you cross out a couple words, it's the same thing we see today. And this was in a newspaper published by the Soviet national newspaper. We are not quote. Yes. We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. You replace bourgeoisie with whiteness. It is not necessary during the interrogation to look for evidence proving that the accused opposed the Soviets by word or action. The first question which you should ask him is, what class does he belong to? What color does he belong to? What is his origin, his education, and his profession? These are the questions which will determine the fate of the accused. Such is the sense and the essence of Red Terror. They don't care. It has nothing to do with who you are as an individualist. And it always bugs me when people talk about individualism, and even when they pretend to be gently questioning the idea of individualism, they don't see this collectivization as a problem. They don't understand that once you stop relating to people as individuals in your own life, much less on a national stage, it can only lead to the dehumanization of people. And that's exactly what we have here.
Yes, because people are not people anymore. Therefore, they are not treated as people, as humans. And I think a part of the lack of resistance was that people still thought, well, I know what the truth is, and there's truth is somewhere, but that the system is not built on truth. It's not looking for truth. It's not interested in truth. So that is just completely taken out of the works. And, as an individual, you think, well, I know I haven't done anything. I'm innocent. So you rely on that truth. And I think people who resisted the most, who never, for the lack of a better term, sold their souls, were people who lived by truth. He talks about it as religious people, but I think it's the people who knew deep down what the truth was and were never willing to give that up, not lie to themselves or others, just simply not lie, because the whole thing starts with a lie. They make you lie to yourself. You lie all the way through. And maybe some of the people who survived, that's how they survived. But there were those also who just never went down that path. And the most fascinating chapter for me, I think, was the escapers. It's just completely refusing to live in a world where you cannot be free. Even for an hour in the woods being chased down, you're breathing free air. You know, you're a free person at that moment. Even if you die at the end of all that. And reading this book, I just was thinking not so much about what makes people evil and do evil things. That's kind of it's easy to go down that path, but what makes people resist that and remain completely undamaged? What is in us that some people have, maybe all of us have, we just don't know how to use it or discover it, but what makes us, some of us, able to resist that untruth and to completely just never even without a doubt in your heart that that's the right way to go, and you would never give that up for anything, not even for your own safety. That's
Depends on what you're scared of. Yeah, I think I've seen people talk about being scared of the right things. Like what causes more fear in you? The idea that you might be beat up, or the idea that you might completely crush your soul, whatever you believe is inside you. You know, what's the worst thing, doing it today or tomorrow? And it also reminded me of one of those things that he starts to show how the ideology was deep within the manner in which they chose who to arrest and how to punish them, where religious people were targeted and given tenors, which is their term for 10 years. Prostitutes were only given 3 years. People who were thieves were given much lighter sentences and often chosen to be rehabilitated, because they saw thieves as people who had no regard for private property. So if you have no regard for private property, then you must be mentally on the right path, because Marx summarized Marxism as the abolition of private property. So we already know you're on the right track. So any person that has any strength of character, those are the types of people that they want to target the first and the hardest.
Yeah. Would it help? For people who haven't read, I was struck by, on page 116, I think it's in the engine room is the chapter 7. There's a list of, so the OSO was the special counsel of the NKVD, which is like the, secret police. And they had, one of the things he talked about was their, and it struck me because it's similar to how the U.S. bureaucracy works now, where there's not laws that they're subject to. There's just their own regulation. They kind of write their own rules, and they actually called. They said you weren't getting a sentence. You were just getting an administrative penalty was being imposed on you. So there was no we don't have to go through like official courts, or it doesn't have to be that you violated a law. This is just basically it's equivalent to you violated a regulation and we're penalizing you. And instead of a fine, that's 25 years in Gulag, right? Like that's the penalty, right? And instead of a court, you just sit in front of a bureaucrat and he checks off some boxes and says that you violated the opaque rules. But let me list some of the rules that because the OSO did have rules, and I think people will be fascinated by this. So let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let me just read like all 10 of these. The first one is ASA, anti-Soviet agitation. Okay. Second one is counter-revolutionary activity. The third one is counter-revolutionary Trotskyite activity. And Solzhenitsyn says, and that tea made the life of a Zek in camp much harder. A Zek, by the way, is a prisoner, right? So Trotskyite was worse than a regular counter-revolutionary. Suspicion of espionage. Espionage went beyond the bounds of suspicion, was handed over to a tribunal. So this is just suspicion. You're getting thrown in prison for years over suspicion of espionage. Contacts leading to suspicion of espionage, like getting thrown in jail for contacts leading to the suspicion of espionage. This is my favorite one. Counter-revolutionary thought. get thrown in prison. Counter-revolutionary thought. Dissemination of anti-Soviet sentiments. Socially dangerous element, which is distinct from the next one, which is being a socially harmful element. That's the Twitter version. Too much harm. Criminal activity. A favorite accusation against former camp inmates if there was nothing else to be used against them. And finally, he says there was a very expansive category. Member of a family. This is of a person convicted under one of the foregoing letter categories. So it was institutionalized guilt by association, and the vagaries of this stuff. I mean, I was just struck that they wrote it down. I had kind of always assumed that there were written rules that seemed pretty clear, but they were just violating them all and no one cared. But they just wrote it down. Like, nope, you're a family member of someone who is convicted of counter-revolutionary thought. Off to the Gulag.
It's amazing. And you know, sometimes we see that people are saying the quiet part out loud. And when they do that, it's because they truly believe it. And they believe it so much that they can't believe that anyone would think it's a problem for them to say it out loud or write it down. And we see that, we still see that, because, you know, we find hidden videos of people saying those things all the time, even though people slough it off, but it's like, no, that is what they actually believe, and that's how we get in these situations.
Yeah.
I see parallels, some of those crimes that Carter just read, like the dissemination of anti-Soviet thought and the antisocial behavior. It sounds like that's some of those are listed. The new law enforcement agency that they're establishing, the Ministry of Truth, they're calling it, part of the Department of Homeland Security, the disinformation. That is the crimes that they're going after. And they're in a law enforcement branch for certain things. So reading through this, looking for parallels to what people are using today is useful today.
Yeah, I mean, this being my second all the way through reading, it was even more, you know, and I wonder if it's because I'm more comfortable with the literature, or because we're moving more in that direction. I just have more examples of those things. Unfortunately, I think it's the latter, but you know, it's kind of like, you know, what do you do about it?
Yeah, that's a separate question. First, you just have to get people to recognize it. So I think that, you know, that's just an example. I don't mean to go into that, the new DHS agency, but people don't even recognize it. They don't see it. And I find reading these kind of books like this one helps clarify that. Like, oh, this sounds, and replace two words in that list, and it sounds like what this new department's about.
Yes,
and it is a guilty
truth.
As Sagita said, it's a guilty until proven innocent. And that is the policy of all these social medias as far as censoring. And the Soviet Union was clearly about censoring information. Like, that was a huge part of why they're arresting people on suspicion. Some of the, I mean, I didn't know a lot of the details in this, but like one of the ones I thought of when you were talking about arresting everyone, when during World War II, when the Soviet Union, quote unquote, liberated from the Nazis, some of the Eastern European countries, one of the things they did was any Russian immigrants that had gone there in past years, they arrested them and threw them in the Gulag. Like, they don't want those people to go back to Russia and talk about what life's like in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and certainly anybody that came from Germany, including people that were in the military, right? They saw how Germans lived. I had no idea reading this book that, you know, all this was going on, you know, in immeasurable detail, why they were the allies of the United States government. Like how did Roosevelt and Churchill not know what was going on? And it made me wonder in the end, like, was it really a good thing that Russia defeated the Germans as far as Russia goes? Like, I'm not convinced after reading this book that the Germans were worse. Like, maybe it would have been
yeah.
better for the Russian
Numbers
people
were
if the
smaller.
Nazis took over Russia.
Well, and the one thing to
Numbers were-
remember, and it's something that they don't talk a lot about in history, is that when Russia, during World War II, when Russia was occupying German territory, and American soldiers were there too, and we even had civilians over there, like wives were over there because we were building bases at the time still. The war was still ongoing, but we had gained enough territory at that point that we could establish even having civilians over there. American women who were there had to wear their husbands' uniforms to not be raped by Russian soldiers. The Russians didn't care. I mean, this was, so it's like, they like to pretend like we always knew they were great allies, but when, and we didn't actually know what they were doing. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, you kind of knew something awful was going on if literally all the American soldiers were like, wear my uniform, it's the only way to protect you. You had to have known something was going on. There was at least chatter. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, best
They
kept
said the-
secret. Everyone knows, but everyone ignores that it's happening. So that's
The British
one of
government
the
was
historical-
turning people over to the Russians.
yes.
To the
Yeah,
Soviet
that was one
Union.
of the things that
they
that
obviously
bothered
knew.
me. Yeah, and well, one of the historical lessons that I learned was how much the West knew stuff
Yeah.
was going on and didn't care. Like the Cossacks, especially the Lienz Cossacks, but just generally the way that the British government treated the Cossacks. I mean, imagine you've got all these people who they're afraid, don't want to go back to Russia. That's got to be a clue. Please, please, please don't send us back to Russia, even though you've been fighting for them and you've been fine. You haven't done anything. Obviously, some of them obviously had, but depending on the groups. But yeah, and the Brits were just like, oh, don't worry. They lied outright. We're not going to send you back. Don't worry. And then they rounded them up and sent them back. And the complicity, how the West was complicit in this, was really disturbing to me. Just to understand how much it was clear, the West knew really, really horrible things were going on, and still turning over Russian citizens, or immigrants who had come to the West, just handing them back, knowing that they're likely going to go get thrown in the gulag.
Right.
Yeah, the story is really chilling about the Ukrainian, rebels, if you want to call it, about the forces that were attempting to defeat the Soviet Union as an independent and trying to get West support and hook up with the West. And the British, they mostly blame the British, but they tricked them. They said, okay, you can join us, turn in your Russian weapons because we're going to give you, Western British-made and American-made weapons. So turn in all your weapons. And then after they did that, they turned them over to the Russians. They had to know.
Mm-hmm. I was growing up, and for the first 10 years of my life in the Soviet Union, Lithuania was still part of the Soviet Union. And we always thought, my father's family, my father was 7 years old. They ended up in gulags. And from the days when I was a little kid, I knew everything about it. And we always thought that the West just didn't know. They just did not know what was happening, that they needed to hear the stories, that they just needed to know. If they knew, they would see, and do something about it. But up until really recent years, I realized that no, everyone knew. Everyone knew, maybe not at the beginning, but definitely later on, everyone knew. And so what was it because the Soviets had nuclear weapons already? I don't even know at what point that was acquired. Was that the reason? Were there other reasons? I just can't figure it out.
I think there's some ideological reasons behind it too. I mean, I think when we say everyone knew, I think there's probably a lot of people who did know in some sense that there was something going on. But I do think that the Soviet Union was incredibly, and still is incredibly, very good at controlling information, which is why we should always be careful at anyone, individuals or groups, who seek to control information. Because even today, I've seen reports where a guy who's in the Ukraine today being bombed, he's calling his dad who's in Russia saying, "Dad, we're leaving. We got to get out of here." And the dad doesn't believe him that anything is happening in the Ukraine. So they're still controlling people by controlling that type of information. And even throughout the time that the gulags were up and running, we had Western intellectuals looking for the progressive grass is greener on the other side, visiting the Soviet Union and taking tours and doing all of this, what we call political pilgrimage. And if anyone is ever interested in understanding that, I can't recommend this more. Paul Hollander, Political Pilgrims. What he does is he has names, places, who went where and did what and wrote what and said what during these times. We had a whole intellectual class that was pro-communism, still had this idea that there is the utopia that would come if and when we implement the right ideas, and that the Soviet Union was doing what it took in order to get us there. So, there is still a lot of this intellectual class who thinks in these manners and writes the papers, writes the articles, that kind of tilt things in a way. And there's some quotes that I read in there because thinking about this, I haven't read the whole thing, but I read the part about the Soviet Union, where even as they were going on tours and seeing that people were kind of like in tattered clothes, et cetera, they didn't look like they were living it up and super, super happy. They would use words like, "Oh, everyone just looks so down home and earthy and they're together and they don't have a lot of money, but they don't need it because they have each other and they have the land." It's kind of like they're still doing stuff like that where they're rationalizing in these crazy ways. And I always think of that, like all these people that some of them I know personally who were rationalizing all the stuff that Antifa is doing while they're holding Soviet Union flags, knowing by now, and you're just a liar. You know what happened in the Soviet Union, and you're rationalizing people who are carrying these flags, destroying private property for a whole summer. So it's, I think at a time there was some unknown, but by now people know exactly what happened.
I think people don't want to know, right? Like you're saying, like people maybe didn't know, or then they do know. I think that I can't overemphasize enough how I'm agreeing with Thomas on this. Like there's an ideological desire to not know, right? And I think one of the biggest sins that you can commit is the sin of evasion, which is when you think about something and it feels uncomfortable, you stop thinking, like you evade that thought. You don't want to go down that next level. And open up Pandora's box. And I think that's what happens with this intellectual class. They are, even if they weren't explicitly Marxist, although at the time, I think there was plenty of explicit Marxism in.
They were proud of it.
Yeah. I mean, plenty in America. So the intellectual class has been deeply Marxist for a long time. And even when they aren't explicitly Marxist, they certainly adopted all of the underlying philosophical tenets necessary to establish Marxism or neo-Marxism or some Marxist type of thing. So they're totally open to it. They have had an antipathy towards American the American values as outlined in Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for generations. The intellectual class has hated them, just despised America, and so I don't think they want to know. They were all rooting for the Soviet Union to show us how stupid and wrong and backwards and evil America was. All of them were hoping that capitalism would fall. They all wanted the Soviets to win. And so when anyone presented any evidence to suggest that their idol was, rusty,
murdering
or
millions of people.
or perhaps evil. Yeah, they didn't want to know it. If you don't want, I mean, that book sounds amazing, Thomas. I'm gonna read it. I already ordered it while you're talking. But if you want to just watch a movie about some of this, there's a movie called Mr. Jones which was made in 2019 about Gareth Jones, who is a journalist from Wales who went to the Soviet Union and realized the truth and tried to expose the truth, and was basically up against Walter Duranty and the New York Times and all these other people. And he ended up actually being killed later on. He ended up being murdered by the Soviets. But it's a really good movie if you just want 2 hours of, here's an example of what it was like to be an honest person trying to report on the Soviet Union.
You know, it's kind of funny though, because like I just finished Roger Scruton's Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, where he goes over the intellectual class's hand waving when it comes to Soviet monstrosity. And there's a lot going on in this book too about comparison to the Holocaust, like a lot. Like he argues in his book that the hand waving would apply to the Holocaust as well if Hitler wasn't a nationalist. That's the one thing that they were like, oh no, that's a hard line for us. Not that he killed a ton of people, because obviously they hand waved 65 million people. You know, they don't care, and they'll gloss over it so hardcore. They just float right by all the death, all the murder, and the horrible living conditions. All that gets slid right past because the ideas are the only thing that matters to an intellectual. And I find that like really, like, I know that the phrase is maybe a little trite, but maybe they should touch grass, because they have no sense of reality. And that's a huge reason why they keep not being able to just swallow the reality of all these deaths as intellectuals. So, for example, like Foucault, he got sick later in life, and he started to like have different ideas. He started to like move back because of his illness. He started to realize that some of the things he thought were probably dumb, you know, because reality slapped him in the face. And that's the thing, is that like a lot of these intellectuals, they live such sheltered lives, the big ones, the ones that hand wave all this, that they have no sense of actual hardship. And they believe that if the great experiment of socialism came to them in their lifetimes, that they would still live these cushy lives. They believe that. I don't necessarily believe that would be true, because there were plenty of intellectuals in Russia, in China, who were killed, who went to gulags, who went to prison camps. They didn't continue to live their cushy lives, even if they spouted the party line. Something they said at some point, some little thing could be interpreted and they could be taken out. Because for one thing, they had attention, and the state couldn't have them have that attention, because that maybe people would rally behind them as counter-revolutionaries, and that is a problem. But
thinkers are a problem generally.
Yes,
even if you thought your way into Marxism, you're still a problem for the Marxists, because you're doing this thinking thing, and that's not
no. Just follow the party line. Don't even even come up with your own conclusions ever. And like, to me, I find that kind of sad and pathetic and kind of narcissist, that you think you'd be okay in that situation as an intellectual. Like, no, you're not. And I find it just really sad that they're spreading this BS, because it's not intellectually sound, it's not rationally sound, the things that they're saying. It's not supported by the reality of history, anything that they're saying. We have enough data essentially at this point to know it is all worthless bunk, but they just keep pushing it. And it's like, I don't know how, it's like that teacher's sign that says like lessons every child should learn, and what, like, say please, say thank you. Communism has failed, and every time it has been tried.
Right.
It's like, it's basic. Come on, we got this.
Yeah. Do you think they actually? You're making me wonder, Alex. Do you think they actually want their ideas to come to fruition, or do you think they just want things to stay the same and to get the uh adulation and praise and clout that comes with the moralizing about how there's a superior system and they understand it and everyone else is stupid, and if we just did this thing? Because i I think for many of these people, if you really gave them a chance and like, okay, you can wave a magic wand, do you actually want that system, or do you want to stay in the system and have the clout and prestige that you have criticizing the current system? I think they would choose the latter. Many.
I think you're right, because they could get on a plane right now, but they don't. They could totally afford to.
Yes,
and they
yes,
don't
they
do
could
it.
totally go do that. Yeah, right.
But
Right, and all throughout the Cold War, they could have. I'm sure if they had said, "Hey, Soviet Union Khrushchev, I would like to join your great. I've got another. I'd like to help on the next 5-year plan." They would
they
be welcome.
totally could, but they don't. And so I've said this a lot about activists, that they, of any stripe, that activists want a problem to be unsolvable, because then they are always important and always earning money. I don't trust most activists because of that reason. They say, look at this problem. I can't give you real metrics of how it is a problem. Or my metrics, if you look too closely at them, they're stupid and they make no sense. But I'm here to solve the problem, give you the money, and it's a forever problem. It's something we have to fight forever. Like, so in that regard, I think a lot of them fall under that camp, that they just want to keep the grift going on that. And it's hard not to recognize it, like, once you are aware that that's something, because of the self-motivating factor of being a human being, and everything is about, your own personal happiness and financial growth for most people. But there are so many people who are like, I need a hero, and they fall for it. And even if they did suffer an issue, like after 9/11, there were so many false charities out there saying, like, we're gonna do some great things for people, and they were fake. They were just taking people's money. And you have to be on guard for this false charity everywhere. And that is what activism mostly is, especially when it comes to social issues. Like, sadly, I think it's almost entirely grift.
I'm not convinced that their motivation is monetary, though, because some of them have a skill set of they're very good organizers and manipulators, and they network very well, and they could make more money doing something else. Often, I think it's a low tech version of a social credit system. I think they like the prestige and the moral status that they get being an activist. I mean, they need a certain amount of money as well. But and I know there's some examples of people who are clearly just driven by the money. Like, I get that, but I don't know. For a lot of them, I suspect it's not actually just the money that they're after.
I usually use an "and" on that one, because there is the whole self-importance aspect of it. Like, some of them are there just for the self-importance. And they could see, the thing is, though, is that you could go into regular private business and make a lot of money, but no one's going to look at you like you're a hero. And
They'll despise you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So they want that too. Like, that's why I say "and." It's both. They want, they're narcissists who want to be seen as a hero, and they want money. They want both.
Yeah. I think this was interesting in that Political Pilgrims book, in reference to our intellectuals here. So a writer at the time, Louis Fisher, offered another familiar explanation of those attitudes. Quote, "Why, instead of holding my tongue, did I not come out in 1937 or 1938 as a critic of the Soviet regime? It is not so easy to throw away the vision to which one has been attached for 15 years. Moreover, in 1938, the Soviet government's foreign policy was effectively anti-appeasement and anti-fascist, much more so than England's or France's or America's. It helped China, it helped Spain with arms to fight the Nazis and Mussolini. It encouraged Czechoslovakia to stand firm. I hesitated to throw stones in public. You know, and I think that throwing stones in public to your own people often happens today, to where we see a lot of people doing crazy stuff, whether it's online or whatever. But if they're on your side, you tend to only support whatever it is they're doing based on the fact that they're on your side, or they're against whatever you're against. And I think that line about being anti-fascist is really important to what we see today, to where almost, you know, if somebody doesn't believe in the devil, they believe that fascism exists at the very least. And I think in the minds of a lot of people, they've replaced evil and the devil with fascism and fascists. So, or just Nazis, as they would say. So when I've seen this happen in conversations about this, to where when we talk about the Soviet Union, you know, they'll say, yeah, but they fought the Nazis. And it's kind of like, yeah, they did fight the Nazis, but it wasn't because of a moral imperative. I mean, it's not like the Bloods and the Crips don't fight. That doesn't mean they're that different. It's not like the Protestants and the Catholics don't fight. It's not like the Shias and the Muslim and the Sunnis don't fight. So just because you fight another person doesn't mean necessarily you're that different than them. You just have different ideas at the time. I mean, you have the same ideas, you just have different goals. And it's like the people who are the most the same usually end up fighting the most. I mean, it's like Cain and Abel. I mean, they were brothers. You know, it's not like he said, oh, wait, you know, I was going to hurt you for these ideological reasons, but you're so close to me. You know, so I think a lot of people see this as, well, the Soviet Union fights fascism. Fascism is the worst thing. It's the devil. So they necessarily must not be that bad. Maybe we can forgive some of their sins, but they have an overall vision and they're on the right side of history.
What I find funny about that, using fascism as the devil, is that they don't even know what fascism is. Most of these people who like point the finger at fashion, you know, it's fascism. They don't recognize it when it's right in front of their faces. They're just parroting what someone is telling them it is.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this. My suspicion, because of that, Alex, right? Because so many people don't know what it is. My suspicion is that they are. So remember, many of these people are. They do adopt the collectivist mentality of Hegel and Marx. They are class bigots. They see the world in terms of class, and they are bigoted about that. And I don't think what they dislike about fascism is anything with respect to the structure of the state or any of the things that make fascism fascism. I think what they don't like about, specifically about German fascism, was the racist component, because it's a bigotry based on different lines. And they want bigotry based. They've historically, and this is changing now because we have Ibram X. Kendi, but they historically have wanted the. It's like there's the collectivists that are class bigots fighting the collectivists that are race bigots, and their entire focus is on that, like, well, these are the race bigots and they're really bad, without stepping back and understanding, like, no, it's the collectivism that's the really bad thing, not the fact that they're applying it. It's almost like, hey, they're applying my thing to race. That's not where my thing gets applied. My thing gets applied to class. That's why they're evil. And it's like, no, your thing is evil. That's the fundamental problem. And I don't think they understand. I think when they think fascism, I think that's what they think.
The thing is, though, is that the Soviet Union was very racist. So is their big hero Che. Like, the thing
but not
is,
overt. Soviet Union wasn't overtly racist in, like, they did. I don't think average people knew that the Soviet Union was.
Yeah, they were pretty horrible to their indigenous people. And then and Che was actually an imperialist as well. But they're totally willing to like overlook those things. Like, if they do learn about them, they're like, oh well, it's not that big big deal.
Well,
Like,
it's kind of like what's her name on The View said, it's white on white crime. So in the paradigm that we use today, Ukrainians versus Russians, it has nothing to do with race or where they live. They see them as the same people. And I thought it was interesting. I can't remember if it was Gulag or A Day in the Life of Desinovich, that the author talks about Ukrainians as if they are different people from him. They have a different language and they have a different way of being, and they don't. And then he said, but Russians do this. So, I mean, even with, this conversation, they see them all as different. But I think in our global perspective today, in the fighting of those two camps, they don't see Russians versus Ukrainians or anything that happens over there as anything to be, or Lithuanians, they don't see that as something that's any people against the other people. They're just all white people.
well, and here's the thing too, is that like, there's a joke by Eddie Izzard saying that the reason like Pol Pot died under house arrest for killing Cambodians, like so many, we're not even quite sure, while Hitler invaded Poland. And so, but Pol Pot, that was his own country. His joke is that the global stage does not intervene unless you're invading another nation. However, and this is what I add on to that, if you can convince the global stage that that part of the world is technically supposed to be yours in the first place, they won't do anything. Hence, Tibet being part of China and them making moves on Taiwan, or even this Russia going after Ukraine. A lot of people are just going to go, well, it's really part of the same country. And then they'll be okay with the death. They won't see it as a big deal anymore. I think that's kind of a problem, is that like, I'm not for interventionism on the whole, but at the same time, this whole idea that we can, go hands off just because it's like, well, they've rationalized it for us, so we're okay.
It's related to the ignoring of democide generally, right? When people talk about like death tolls generally, they talk about wars, like, oh, look at how many people were killed in World War II or in Vietnam or whatever. But we don't talk about how many people of their own people governments have killed, right? Like, what did the Khmer Rouge do? What did Mao do? What did Stalin do to his own people? We seem to have this, and I think it's a religion of worshiping the government, frankly. But we seem to have this thing where, like, well, you're the warlord over this territory, so what you do isn't really any of our business with that territory. It's kind of like, and especially if there's some semblance of it being for the greater good and for people, if it's not just someone who's blatantly saying, yes, I'm the warlord, but someone, oh no, I'm representing the proletariat. These are the, I'm the tip of the Bolshevik iceberg. It's not a big deal. We forgive anything then, because we kind of treat entire regions of people as if they're a single individual. And it's like, well, if Alex wanted to cut herself, I would probably say it's a bad idea, but I wouldn't feel like I needed to rescue her because it's Alex's own decision. And I think we view countries that way, like, well, you're killing your own people, but I guess it's part of your master plan. Like, I don't really like it. I think it's a bad idea, but I don't want to get involved.
Yeah, the Russians weren't invading as much. They weren't trying to take over Europe the way Germans were.
And then I'm sorry if I'm echoing, in terms of educating people about all these atrocities, on the mass scale, I think there's a mistake being made, kind of presenting it to the kids as if like some crazy people did some crazy stuff. It's just insanity. No, it's very calculated, planned, thought through. It's ideology. It's not an accident, and it's not insane people doing insane things somewhere in the world. And that's the tragedy of, just repeating this over and over. Like, I don't know. There's more to it, of course, but part of it.
Well, there's a reason for that. Then you don't have to examine. Yeah, but then you don't have to examine it. If you say, well, Stalin was just an insane person, then you don't have to ask the question of like, what the hell kind of ideology led to that? Like, well, we don't have to ask. There was no ideology. It's not related to communism. It's just Stalin.
Could I do the same thing?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I say that like when it comes to mass murder too, like this, I think it's another form of hand waving, of saying someone's just insane or saying someone's just evil. It's a way of trying to avoid the conversation of why this happened and how, and you cannot, if you don't know why, you can't prevent it in the future. It's going to happen again. That's the real issue, is that it's like, if you keep pretending as though it's a simple answer, just insanity, it's like a hurricane, it came and it hit us. Like, no, it's human beings acting, and you have to, if you can figure out why they did it, you can possibly prevent it in the future. But I don't know if it's laziness, intellectual laziness,
it's
or
intentional.
fear.
They don't want to be. It's the same reason you were talking about with the intellectuals. It's intentional because they don't want to be examined. They don't want their ideas or motivations to be examined. That's the worst thing for the most Western intellectuals, is to have their intentions or ideas examined and scrutinized, because they are, in fact, it's that evasion thing. They have a sense that something's wrong, right? Like, oh, this thing I've been pushing for killed 100 million people last century. Should I examine it? Well, that makes me uncomfortable because I might find some things that I don't like about my ideology. Therefore, I should not examine it. What's a great way to not examine it? Oh, a crazy dude. The end. Like, I've explained it. It's a crazy dude. Now we can move on. Can we not ask that question anymore? I've got tweets to write, right? Like, and that's the end. That's it's a self-preservation thing. I don't think it's laziness. That's my opinion.
One of the things that I learned in reading about some of the ideology behind Nazism too, that helps uncover the fact that it's not just a crazy dude. There's a whole literature that they had and a buildup of that ideology over the years leading up to that. And some of those people who wrote that ideology were Nobel Prize winning physicists. So it wasn't a bunch of crazy, stupid people. They truly believed a lot of this stuff, and they had a lot of intelligent people behind them. And there was a lot of other people. I mean, a lot of part of this book, The Political Pilgrims, goes into the Nazism as well. People don't know that JFK took a trip over to Nazi Germany prior to the war, and reveled at the orderliness with which Hitler was organizing his country to a single purpose. He said something like that. There's tons of people who, until they saw the pictures of the concentration camps, still had this idea that it'd be great to have a strong leader that organized their people in a common direction and pushed them towards that better purpose. So just like the Soviet Union, you had intellectuals doing the same thing. And part of it is just the grass is always greener somewhere else. And I can be seen as an incredibly brilliant critic if I can critique all of the things about my own country and talk about how other things and other ideas, the ideas that I possess, that some other people are doing too, are better than all of you peasants.
Yeah. I think we only got to like halfway through this book. Is there stuff in the later? And I'll admit, I didn't actually finish it because I got sick. So I still need to finish this. But as far as I can tell, we only have started talking about the first half of the book. Is there stuff in the second half that struck you that is important that we should talk about?
Some of it, yeah. Oh, no. Yeah, just read the first half. Everything else is crap. Yeah, I mean, there's parts in it that I thought were really interesting. And one of the things that I wrote down is how it was, as the writer started putting this information out, he starts talking about some of the responses that he got. And it was very much negative within some of the intelligentsia of the nation. They had this concept that, we need to move on with our lives. And what we need to do is put the past in the past and start working towards the future. And one of the quotes that he said of that they would say is, why complain about starving to death when there are sufferings more intolerable than hunger? It's like, it's only hunger. There's a lot of things that can be worse than hunger. And it reminded me
and
of
the NKVD invented them, many of them, as
right.
far as I can tell. Yeah.
It reminded me of a post I saw a lot on social media recently was, why complain about gas prices when there are people dying in the Ukraine? You know, it's always this whataboutism about, why are you complaining about this? There's worse stuff. And then you're going to experience something worse. And they'll say, well, why are you complaining about that? There's still worse things that can happen. It's as if they keep kicking that can down the road of comparative suffering, as if I shouldn't start at the very beginning of a bad idea and cut it at the roots.
When it comes to comparing your situation to other people's, I don't think it helps anything to have someone outside yourself tell you something like that. I think it can help you to say that to yourself, like to get past hardship. But other people saying it is not helpful, especially when I know I listened to a psychiatrist talk about how this whole idea that depression is entirely in your head is bullshit when you're having a hard time paying your bills every month and you're struggling like crazy, or you can't sleep at night, shit like that, that really does lead into something like depression. And I feel like that's kind of true when it comes to suffering in the real world. Like if I can't get to work anymore because I can't fill my gas tank, that's a real world issue that someone needs to help me with. That's not something I can think my way out of necessarily. So it's not something someone can just say to me, people are dying in the Ukraine, you need to shut up. That's a way of telling people, don't make demands for change. That is,
Well,
if you're
it's a way of excusing bad behavior. Like if I cut off your arm and you're like, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I could kill you. Like, stop complaining. Like, yeah, that's true, but cutting off my arm is also bad. Like, so I'm focused on the one bad thing happening to me right now. Stop stop reminding me that you could do worse. It's just a way to excuse bad behavior is all. I mean,
and so it's often just an attempt to change the subject, which like changing the subjects is not an argument. You say, well, how come I'm not talking about the thing that you want to talk about? Like, that's not a response to my concern here.
It's a non sequitur.
Like, sure. Yeah. Like I just respond, don't change the subject. I'm not a fan of the argument. How come you're not talking about the thing I would rather talk about? Sorry. Make your own post. That's usually what that is.
When they do post it, they post it as one of those things on Facebook is like, stop complaining about gas, people are dying in the Ukraine. And it's like, you just invited me into an argument is what you did. And over the fact that both these issues are important, but one of them is more important to the people here in the US. That's what you just did.
Yeah. And you can say, stop complaining about people dying in the Ukraine. Marxist philosophy had killed 100 million people last century and it's still going. Like, or what? Like, you could always up it.
That's a fun way to troll them a little. You could say, yeah, you're really worried about that, but you know that it's been 400 years since Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus were all aligned. So that's really what we need to be talking about.
Someone in chat pointed this out, and I don't know if you Thomas, if you want to talk about this a little bit, because I imagine you know way more about it than I do. But Charlie says, when Solzhenitsyn came to the USA, he was not heralded by the media as a hero. And I do know that, especially later on, once they realized he was more about religion and actually not a liberal democracy kind of guy as much, I think they didn't love him as much. Do you want to address any of that? Because I don't know too much about it other than what I just said.
Yeah, I don't know specifically what was going on. I haven't read any criticism of him from people in the States. I do know that as he came to the States and he was living in Vermont, I believe, he started to criticize the United States and the passiveness with which they permitted so many things. And then when he finally went back to Moscow and lived there, he saw the same Western type democracy or ideas invading his country. And one of the things that he said about it was that instead of leaving communism and going back to some kind of principles of a higher authority, people started getting plugged into pop culture and becoming, he didn't say this exactly, but it was almost like they substituted being brain dead for being communist. And a lot of the same things were still going on, and there were still a lot of oligarchs and people like that controlling the country and doing bad things just in a different way. But they just started to allow this thing to feed their people the same kind of way that we talk about how people just sit and watch Netflix and chill instead of paying attention to the things that we need to pay attention to until it's too late because they've been too busy chilling.
Interesting.
I just wonder if there was
there.
some factor that when he showed up in the United States and started talking about this, there's a lot of people who didn't want to hear it. Like, you're bringing up bad things about my ideal economic system, right?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of that too.
resist.
And many of the people who go into writing the papers that would have discussed what he had to say came from the schools where a lot of those ideas are discussed as if it's a good idea, but we just need to implement it correctly. And I mean, even today, I mean, how many people even know that more than 80 million people died during this? Or in China, what actually happened in Cuba? There's still this sense that we just need to look at the Nazis and make sure we don't do that.
Mhm.
And another thing I learned in the book is that the term concentration camp originated in the Soviet Union. It was just then applied to what was happening in Germany. So, I mean, when we're talking about the horrors of Germany,
Did Thomas freeze for everyone, or just
he froze for me? Yeah.
Oh.
But yeah, talking
I
about
back?
the horrors there. Yep, you're back.
You're back.
Oh,
You're back.
okay. Yeah, I was just saying that the horrors of the Gulag started a lot earlier than Hitler was even thought of. I think Hitler was still in a ditch watching his buddies get blown to bits when the Soviet Union was starting to put together these camps.
So he was inspired by them, maybe.
By
Right.
Lenin, right?
Yeah.
World War One.
Yeah, Lenin did it.
talking
Yeah,
about.
that was one of the things that Solzhenitsyn talked about. Is people talk about Stalin a lot and how evil he was, but he puts together a lot of evidence that much of this process started with Lenin before Stalin was even on the scene, and Stalin helped to perfect what Lenin began.
Well, Stalin was his pupil. He continued. He did not change paths or anything. He just continued on that line and built it up. And I think part of the problem is, as Solzhenitsyn says somewhere in the book, that, this was never, there were no trials of any kind. There's just no closure to what happened in the Soviet Union, to the Gulag system. And, with, let's say, Hitler's, Nazi atrocities, that there was a closure. There was something, definitive at the end of that. Maybe not all the way, but at least, just universally. And, to this day, Marxism is being taught, and, nobody bats an eye, but Nazi ideology somehow is not being taught. And, let's think about this, or, maybe it just wasn't done the right way or whatever. Like, that would never cross anyone's mind. But somehow this ideology is very popular, and no one thinks there's anything wrong with it. Maybe
it reminds me
there was no closure.
Yeah, and it reminds me, when you talk about closure, one of the things Solzhenitsyn talked about was during the Nuremberg trials. Those trials were incredibly popular in the Soviet Union, and when the people would write in the paper, and it was common to hear people say, "Oh, 56,000 Germans convicted and put on trial. That's not enough. They need to be punished for all of what they did." So not only in the Soviet Union was this happening, but we're also seeing Nuremberg trials across the world, and getting visuals and hearing about this stuff and starting to get primed for this concept that this is the ultimate evil. And in the Soviet Union, I think it was on, I can't remember the exact number, but he said something like maybe 18 people were convicted and tried. And you can get on he would be on buses and trains and visiting places and hear people talk about their experience during those times. And some of them were actually those people committing those crimes and talking about it somewhat freely. So they didn't deal with this at all. The world didn't deal with this at all. It wasn't put out on the stage in the same way that the Nuremberg trials put Nazism and Germany on the world stage as far as being that source of evil. And maybe it has something to do with what we talked about earlier, where they were part of the axis to where the Soviet Union was allied with us in defeating the Nazis, where we were much more concerned about what happened in Germany, even though it was, I think, tenfold worse in the Soviet Union.
Well, and I think that's part of the reason why the intellectual class in Western society is able to handwave so easily the atrocities in the Soviet Union, because there is no world stage trials for all these people. Like that would be a huge thing to have happened. Like, would they have handwaved some of Nazism if there wasn't these trials? I think so. I do. Because there are people still trying, who are, of the intellectual class, trying to handwave Nazism even now, saying Hitler was right. Like that is a thing that is happening. And so, to me, I think that if we had if the world stage had had those trials, it would be a lot harder for socialism, for communism, for Marxism to have the hold it does, because we'd have that marker in history. Because it's really easy to just brush it all under the rug without actual criminal justice involved. It's way too easy to just brush it aside and pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember when he was giving those numbers about the Nuremberg trial compared to what happened in the Soviet Union. He was worried about the morality of the next generation, to where what they would end up believing is that might equals right, and that people who are in power are never held to account. And I can't help but think that some of that has leaked into what we're seeing today.
Yeah. I think that's based on my understanding of Russian history, that's a very common Russian sentiment for centuries, is like strong leadership that is kind of unaccountable is a good thing. So I think,
but not nearly as brutal as the current. Yeah, he did talk about some of the differences between some of the earlier leaders before Lenin. He talked about even Catherine the Great, and I think she actually outlawed executions. And there was a lot of centralized strength, and they looked up to the leaders, but there wasn't this brutality that the ideology brought in.
Yeah, and that took Marx, right? That took communism to.
Thank you.
Yeah. You guys don't have to end, but I have to take off. Excuse me. So I'm gonna bow out, but this has been an awesome discussion, and thank you for being an advocate for this book, Thomas, because I've really enjoyed it. I'm probably gonna read the whole 3-volume set at some point. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Carter.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, it was a great book, and I'll have to say I was cursing you and thanking you and cursing you.
Why the curses?
Because it's so chilling. I think I had a little bit of the I would rather not know all this detail, and it is difficult to get through the descriptions of the torture. And I wanted to fast forward. I listened to the Audible version, which was really interesting. It's kind of a side thing, but I was going to bring it up. It's narrated by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He's the narrator of the Audible version. So I was like, same last name, look him up.
That's a relative.
He's the middle son of the author, born in Moscow in 1972. And another little interesting tidbit, He's the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, Philadelphia Philharmonic Orchestra.
I'm
That's
gonna
what he
have to go
does. He's a
watch this
pianist and an author. And yeah, maybe you could go see him in concert. He was born in 72. He's 48, 49, something like that. So
sometime.
yeah, that's what he does for a living. Yeah, and he started out as a pianist. When you brought up Vermont, I had noticed it said that he started his music study in Vermont. So his music education initiated in Vermont under somebody in Burlington. So that's where Solzhenitsyn lived, I guess, when he came to America.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I remember we also read in book club maybe a couple of years ago now, Ordinary Men, and it reminded me of some of those same themes where it's tough to read through some of these details, but it's important to know those details and put yourself in that same situation to where you have to understand that it can be you, and you have to understand those details and feel that horror to take it seriously. And I think that's true of most good literature. If it's just a summary, then it's not going to be effective.
Yeah, I can imagine what the. Go ahead.
I was going to change the subject to what I loved, what my favorite chapter. So if you want to go on, Keith, you can.
No, go ahead.
I really love the blue hat chapter more than anything.
Blue caps. Yeah.
Because of the fact that he puts it in second person, it really pushes you to acknowledge your own capacity for evil, because these are just regular people technically, and there's so many of them, and I don't know, it really pushes home just how universal this kind of act is, and it's very important. And I think that was a brilliant. He didn't have to put it in second person. He didn't have to, but doing so really, really has a great effect, I think, on a reader. It's awful at the same time because you imagine yourself doing some of these things and you want to fight it. But I think it's important. It's really important to acknowledge your capacity and everyone else's capacity to do this. As we keep bringing this up, that it's so universal. And if you're willing to act as though this happened there, it happened so long ago, it's a different culture, it's a different people, it doesn't matter anymore. You risk so much for the future by pretending like it's not possible. And I think him putting it in second person was just absolute brilliance.
There was a podcast
such a great point. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I say there's a podcast that I listened to earlier. I can't remember who said it, but they said, if you're going to read only one chapter of the Gulag Archipelago, read the Blue Caps. And I mean, go ahead.
And then elsewhere, when he describes the system, the sewer system, it just kind of all throughout, he uses we. He's not excluding himself from the responsibility for what happened overall. So the you and the we, such a great point, Alex. I didn't think about it this way, but that totally makes sense. Yeah.
Like, I feel like he could say it, like, and he does say it, that it's a capacity in all of us. He flat out says it, but I feel like that brings it home cognitively for a reader way better. And he also does it for the torture. So in some instances, which is, again, it's brilliant. And I think when it comes, I don't know how it is in the original Russian. That's the thing. But this translation, putting the pronoun choices were just so good. Just so good at cognitively bringing all the major points home.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I love that quote that I ended with, where the line between good and evil is that separates the heart of every person. It has nothing to do with finding the bad guy. It's making sure that line between good and evil in your own heart is going towards the good at all times. Because if you're not paying attention, you're always looking at the evil outside. The evil inside you is going to happen, is going to start vacillating more towards the evil. and you're going to use that evil to defeat what you think is the evil out there. Well, we've been going for about 2 hours now. I wanted to thank you guys for reading the book and joining us, and anyone on chat joining us, and wherever you happen to be watching the stream. I can't emphasize enough how great a book this is and how important it is to understanding the nature of humanity and really starting to help us recognize what's going on today, and maybe a bit of a wake-up call for how very basic ideas that seem somewhat harmful can grow into being things that are incredibly devastating, not only to individual people, but to a whole nation. So did anyone else have anything to say before we close?
I should
Thank
probably
you for choosing this book. I mean,
Yeah.
it's absolutely one of the most important books for anyone. It absolutely is. So thank you.
Agreed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I learned a
I'm
lot.
very glad. I'm very glad that I read it. But I guess since Carter popped off, maybe I should mention what we're reading next.
Yes, please. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, I'm the advocate for the next book club, which is going to be on June 12th, and the book is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. You have to get a hard copy because it does weird things with the format. Let me see if I can find a page. Like this. So it's a very long book. That's why it's June 12th, and I will be the advocate. It is fiction, but it's my best way of describing it in a short blurb is it is postmodernist, epistological horror, magic realism. I mean, that's a lot of descriptors because the book is doing a lot. And yeah, again, that's on June 12th, and I will be the advocate for that book. Oh, Thomas, you're muted. You're still muted.
I think he wants to say goodbye to everyone. So, Thomas, if you're going to say muted, I'll close out. Give me a thumbs up if that's what you want. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining. Yes, better start working on Alex's book now. It's a long one. Don't they have an abridged version for me? I need an abridged Audible version.
Nope. And there's no audiobook either. You have to read it.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost my screen. I was like,
That's
oh,
fine.
I can't get it on me.
Well, I want to find out what magic realism is anyway.
Oh, it's amazing. When you said that, I got so excited.
Yeah, this is
Well,
so
then you should
outside of
read
my
my new
normal
book.
realm.
I will read. And yours is short, so I might do that one first. How come you didn't pick your book?
Why? How narcissistic would I be to say, let's read my book for the next book club?
Yeah.
Well, who's
thanks
after
again.
you? If I'm next,
yeah.
maybe I'll pick it.
No, I just finished my Thomas Sowell children's book, and it's 14 pages, so maybe we'll do that next.
Oh, that's a good one. I'll pick a short one.
All right, so
Yeah,
I'm excited for that book, Alex. It looks incredibly strange, so I think it'll be a nice change of pace for a lot of us. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you on the next book club. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you online. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you're new to Unsafe Space, check out our deep content library that includes discussions with everyone from James Lindsay to Brett Weinstein. And please consider helping to fund our work by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on a variety of social media platforms, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space Discord server, which is open to financial supporters at any level. We hope to see you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production may be upsetting to Brian Stelter. Please do not expose him to it. For completely legitimate reasons, Taylor Lawrence is requesting any information you may have about the following individuals. The Twitter subroutine appears to be malfunctioning. Pay no attention to it. Did you know that the word liberty is a dog whistle for insurrectionists? If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.